Everybody seems to forget that Hamas has historically been a political movement that also had a militia. They create a vision of an Islamic revival and reform against British imperialism and corrupt Muslim rulers.
How does the Iranian Revolution impact all of that, and also impact how the West or Western governments or Western powers perceive Islamist movements?
So while in prison, Qutb then witnessed the massacre in which 25 members of the Brotherhood were killed and close to 50 were injured. And he concluded that the government had to be overthrown.
To a large extent, this leads into Afghanistan and the war against the Russians, which gives us bin Laden.
Jamaluddin Afghani, I find incredibly fascinating. Abdu came to be called the father of Islamic modernism. Ghanouchi had said to the other parties that if he were elected, he would reach out to all of them. I was born and raised in Brooklyn, New York, in an Italian-American Catholic neighborhood. One of the questions is, nobody's going to see me, right?
No, people are seeing you.
Oh, they are seeing me. Okay, because I've got two different screens, so I want to be careful about. Right.
Okay, no. I can't see you now.
You can see me.
I can't see you. I'm just now I can see you. Yes.
Okay. All right. Good. All right.
Okay. 3, 2, 1. Hi, good day, and welcome to another episode of Unapologetic. Today, I'm really honored to be joined by Professor John Esposito. Professor John, welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you very much. I'm delighted to be with you.
I'm delighted that you are with us. We've been trying to actually organize this episode for a few months, and obviously you have a very busy schedule, and so thank you for that. We're going to have a long conversation today. Professor John Esposito, we'll get to it in a minute, but he's one of the foremost scholars in, I hate the term, and we can probably discuss this term, but in political Islam and Islamism. So we're going to be discussing sort of the modern history of political Islam in the last 100 years and how that's manifested and changed due to crackdowns of Arab governments on these movements, due to the war on terror, and due to sort of anti-imperialism and everything else. So, Professor John Esposito, thank you so much for joining us on this conversation.
Good to be here.
Before we actually start with how this movement arose and whether this movement is a new movement or it sort of has its heritage in deeper Islamic ideas and thoughts, I want our audience to get to know a bit about you and how is it that you have become such an esteemed scholar in this, right? So, how did you sort of fall into someone who studied Islam?
Okay, I'll try to do this briefly. It was the last thing that anyone would have expected from me. I was born and raised in Brooklyn, New York, in an Italian-American Catholic neighborhood. As a young man, I spent 10 years with the Capuchin Franciscans. My goal was to be a Franciscan priest and either function in America or be a missionary. And then I decided to leave before ordination. And since I was trained in Catholic theology, I became a young Catholic theologian around the time of Vatican II, did graduate work, was teaching. And I decided then to do a PhD in Catholic theology at Temple University in Philadelphia. But the requirement for the program was that you had to spend a year studying world religions, which I had never done before. I mean, this is back in the day when, Catholics did Catholic theology, Protestants did this, Muslims did that. The idea of world religions, multi-religions was another thing in terms of somebody's career. And as it turned out, my professor in Hinduism thought I had the makings for a dissertation, and I went to the chair, and the chair said, "That's fine, but we just hired a Muslim scholar, and you've got a broad background. It would be good if you took a course with him." I didn't have any great desire to do that. I knew nothing about Islam and Muslims. I had seen a movie called The Exodus, which I thought was historically based, and of course it really wasn't. And I gave in because the chair was, the chair of the department. And I went to see the professor. His name was Ismail al-Faruqi, a Palestinian, and he had just started the program. What was unique about the program, and this is important because it's actually what led to my changing a whole direction in my life, was that Faruqi would travel in the Muslim world and get scholarships for young Muslims to come and study at Temple. They were required to study, do the three religions, you minor in two and major in one. And they were to major in Judaism or Christianity and minor in Islam, since many of them already had a background. What was unique about this back in that day was that there were no major coverage in religion departments in the United States. Professors of Islam were people who did something in a history, department or whatever, and there were no jobs to teach Islam. So that's a very important factor. So I took the course, and then Faruqi called me in the middle of the course and said, well, you need to study Arabic. I said, why would I study Arabic? He said, in order to major in Islam. I said, but I already said I'm not going to major in Islam. He said, sit down and fill out the application. And I thought, again, I was in my late 20s, and I wanted to finish my degree. And I said, fine. And that was to go to the University of Pennsylvania and to study there in the summertime to take Arabic. And I wasn't going to do it. It was very competitive. I didn't expect to get in. I got in, and I asked for 2 weeks to make my decision. Years later, the man that ran that said he had never had a graduate student who took the position of not saying I'm delighted, but rather I need 2 weeks to think about it. And I still wasn't going to major. I just thought, well, they pay me to do this. I wasn't getting summer salary. As it turned out, my professor was the associate director of the Middle East Center for Arab Studies in Lebanon, which is a training ground for British diplomats and some others. And all of a sudden, I found myself in a new career, and a career in which there were no jobs. And when I finished my degree, there were no jobs. I applied to 50 schools, and there was one interview to teach world religions, and I got that. That would have been in the mid 1960s. And I did not begin to develop a career in Islam until the Iranian Revolution. Okay. In other words, there would have been no jobs to hire me to be, to teach Islam solely. And so I often say that I owe my career, my first Lexus, to Ayatollah Khomeini. So there's my story.
Okay, just one more before we actually get into it. So you mentioned that there's a massive interest in sort of Islam after the Iranian Revolution, but was there also sort of an internal moment where you start feeling passionate or interested or curious about what you're actually studying, and you'll be like, this is actually what I want to?
No, I mean, I went from being this, naive person to, my naivete was, for example, when we had our first exam, one of the graduate students, Anis Ahmad, who was a member of the Jamaat-e-Islami, in case anyone in your audience has any background, from Pakistan, he asked to borrow my book. And I said, fine, I need it before the exam. And he said, inshallah, I'll give it back to you. And we continued to talk. And 3 times he said, inshallah, he'd give me the book back. And I remember saying to him, and I meant it, I said, Anis, I don't know you well. I said, but I get nervous if you say 3 times, if God wills, you're going to give me the book back. So it took me a while, but the reason why I think I developed a real interest and even a passion was that here I was in a classroom with a professor. Faruqi was trained in 4 different languages. He was an expert on Islam, but also on Western thought. 90% of my class were students from the Muslim world, stretching from Egypt to Malaysia and Indonesia. And so it was as if I was living overseas. It was like an immersion process. And I became fascinated with Islam, especially, the things that really grabbed me, I think, were, although I wasn't fully conscious of it, it was the idea that, again, going back to that period of history so many decades ago, and still this would be true for many believers, if you were born and raised in a religion and you were involved in your religion, you were devout in your religion, in a sense, with the kind of commitment that I had or somebody else had, you really didn't have exposure to a lot of other people. In America, as large as the country was, most people who were there, if they were Muslim, they would have been identified not so much as Muslim as just as Lebanese, Egyptian, and usually communities stayed to themselves. And so this was a unique experience that I had. And then discovering that, in fact, just as a Christian, I had come to learn both the, if you will, the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible, for Jews, and that is seen as part of the Christian tradition, right? And then Jesus comes, okay? All right. Well, in Islam, you've got the acceptance of major prophets of the past that come out of, if you will, Judaism and Christianity, and then you've got the final prophet, the prophet Muhammad. So those kinds of connections, and in terms of Islam, as a faith, let alone as a practice, and then also being fascinated by the fact that if I had any sense of the past history, it would have been of the Crusades and the Christians being the dominant force against, if you will, as it were, the enemy. And now I had a whole revision and re-understanding of the complexity of that period in history. So it was those kinds of things that I think, really made a big difference. And certainly Ismail and his wife, Lamia, played a major role.
Okay, so we're about to do something very ambitious now, whereas in the next sort of 75 minutes, we're going to try to go through like 120 years of the, the contemporary modern Islamic movement. And I'm not sure if that's possible. And then after that 75 minutes, we'll have a concluding discussion on the present state of the world. So best of luck to both of us. And obviously yes, your knowledge on this is way higher than mine. So if I ask a silly question or anything else, just please free to tell me that that's the wrong question and just answer as you see fit. Just to sort of start off, right? So in my reading, in my understanding, and I guess it's almost popularized now that sort of the founding thinkers of modern political Islam were Afghani and Abdu, and to some extent Allama Iqbal in Pakistan. What was the origins of this? Why did they start thinking about this? And what do you make of? I mean, because this is kind of like this term political Islam. They weren't thinking about themselves as political Islamists, right? So what do you make of that term? But secondly, just walk us through what gave rise to that kind of initiative and what fomented it.
Yeah, no, it's a very good point. I mean, if you really take a look at the origin of modern Islamic thought, ideology, and politics, in many ways, it was launched in the late 19th century and bled over a little bit into the early 20th century. So you had people like Al-Afghani and Muhammad Abdu. And in many ways, they were fascinating in the sense that, what you had and what they shared in common was a sense and a deep understanding of their faith, but also a sense that things weren't working that well. And they also were people who had a unique engagement with the West. Whether we're talking about Abdu or Ahmad Khan, or we're talking about Maududi, or we're talking about Muhammad Iqbal, all called for theological, educational, and scientific development, or if you will, a kind of reformation. At the end of the 19th century, for example, Sayyid Ahmad Khan argued that there was a need for a new theology. As he said, today, as in former days, we need modern sciences today, and we need to bring them into harmony with the doctrines of Islam. For somebody like Iqbal was a philosopher poet who earned a law degree in London and a doctorate in Germany, so he had actually exposure, with the West. And Iqbal said, we need a new theology, a period similar to the Protestant Reformation. The lesson of Luther's movement should not be lost. So that was the kind of approach that he had. Now, when you get down to Afghani and Abdu, it becomes very fascinating, the interaction between these two people. Jamal ad-Din Afghani, I find incredibly fascinating. He lived from 1838 to 1897. That wasn't a very long life. He was born and educated in Iran and in British India. And that's where he first encountered modern education and sciences. But he then traveled, and think about what travel was like in those days, okay? It's not like you get on Qatar Airways, or should I mention an American airline? I don't know. He traveled throughout much of the Muslim world, Afghanistan, India, Persia / Iran, Egypt, and the Ottoman Empire, as well as London and Paris. So the engagement also with the West, as it were. And so he was more of a, also uniquely, a political activist than a philosopher, but he taught Islamic subjects, as it were, at times. But most of his time was really engaging in the country and then becoming embodied in a certain kind of belief. On the one hand, he had his Islam, which he saw as a comprehensive, a cohesive way of life, encompassing politics and society as well as worship. So for him, it wasn't just about, as it were, faith and worship. It was also very much an emphasis on politics and society, okay? And that the true Muslim was to carry out God's will in history. But he also was involved in these different countries that he traveled through and observed in local politics. He stressed that Islam was more than a religion in the Western sense of the term. It was a religion and a civilization. And then for him, Islam was an ideology. It supplied the reason for being, as it were, the purpose or reason for living for Muslims, both as individuals, but also as a socio-political community. So it wasn't just that he was, as it were, an expert on religion, or theology, whatever you want to say. It was very much embedded, his emphasis on, with a political message. And the political message was the danger of European intervention, the need for national unity to resist it, and the need for a broader unity of all Muslim people, and the need for a constitution to limit the ruler's power. So note how he's living in a world in which, for all countries, whether in the West or in the Muslim world, it was a place where you had, as it were, absolute rulers until they died or were, overthrown. Thus, he distrusted both, as it were, Muslim and British rulers, and saw them as the obstacle, as a major obstacle to change. And his genius was that his attitude served as a catalyst, and his preaching, as it were, or his message, which was both, if you will, which was in many ways religio-political, captured and fired the imaginations, particularly of a younger generation. Now, Abdu was a good example of somebody who was very strongly influenced by him. Abdu, who himself lived to be something like, let's say, 56 years old, Abdu came to be called the father of Islamic modernism. Now, why was that the case? First of all, he was a religious scholar who studied at Al-Azhar. And in those days, and even today, but certainly in the past, Al-Azhar University in Cairo was the principal center for Islamic learning, as it were, in orthodoxy. And people came from all parts of the world, and even into the modern period. There are many times when I've known people, for example, in Indonesia and in Malaysia, who, when it comes to religious education, have gone to Al-Azhar. But certainly in the past, and certainly when I was a graduate student, etc., Al-Azhar was, the place to be. And he became very attracted to Afghani's thought and became his disciple. In fact, his most enthusiastic disciple. So publishing newspaper articles reflecting Afghani's ideas. So what happened then was he became involved with Afghani even in the national opposition movement and the revolt against the British and the French influence in Egypt. So he went from being trained and to be, if you will, an ulama, and later on would become the Mufti of Egypt. But he also had this political period in his life because of Afghani's message. And that message included the idea of a resistance to European expansionism. And the way to do that was through Muslim unity and solidarity. So notice, it's not just talking about one country. For both of them, they go outside the specific country that they were in. And also a sense that Islam had become dormant and needed a fresh reinterpretation and reform, you see. But they also added a selective appropriation of Western civilization, and that's what's important. In other words, it wasn't, as very often happened back in the day, on both sides, whether it was the West or in the Muslim world. In each of those worlds, people within that world saw where they were as the place to be, where they were not only physically, I mean intellectually, politically, religiously, etc. Here, there was a sense of, yes, Islam is important, its Muslim unity is important, but with regard to our Islam, it needs a fresh interpretation within this modern world, and it's important, given both their experiences, having not only looked at, but actually engaged in, been in the West, the importance or seeing that which could be and would be important to appropriate from Western civilization. When he became the Mufti of Egypt, he called for a reform in law, theology, and education. So you could see that, you know. And Abdu called for a renewal of Islam, not simply to be based on any kind of secular, Western secular modernization, but actually, when it came to the West, a selective integration of Islam with modern ideas. That made for his rightly being seen as, if you will, an Islamic modernist or a Muslim modernist, or the father of the modernization or modern Islam. But it was his ideas were deeply rooted in, as he said, the duties to God, prayer, fasting, pilgrimage, social duties, family, but also borrowing or appropriating the best that comes from the West.
Okay. I mean, you've touched on a few important things there, and you've mentioned the political aspect, right? So just so that, I mean, obviously there's people listening to us, and some of them are quite familiar with what we're speaking about, and some are less familiar. And I mean, the thing that I wanted to discuss is, to what extent was this anti-colonial? Was this born out of anti-colonialism and sort of pan-Islamism as a movement, and how much of it was about trying to actually reform ideas that were sort of making Islam archaic and not a dynamic, fresh movement like it was in its beginning? But just sort of to help the audience out, Afghani and Abdu, I mean, Afghani travels the world, but eventually he meets Abdu, and sort of that's where the Egyptian branch of modern Islam comes about, which eventually manifests through Hassan al-Banna and the Muslim Brotherhood, and that makes a bunch of offshoots. In Turkey, a similar person is Sayyid Nursi, and that eventually gives rise to actually, I mean, Erdogan is in many ways a result of that. And then in Pakistan, Allama Iqbal, eventually his thoughts sort of germinate. That gives rise to Maududi and the Jamaat al-Islami. And so the Muslim Brotherhood basically has had branches. Obviously, they now in many countries prescribed as terrorist organizations, but they weren't in the 60s and 70s, and they had branches all the way from Morocco, even in the Saudis. I mean, the whole of the Arab world. And obviously Malaysia, Indonesia, all of them sort of eventually it becomes this sort of this transnational idea of festering, and then it splinters into many different branches, and we'll get into that. But I just wanted to kind of paint a picture for the audience before we get into the weeds and all of that. Okay, so kind of, I mean, you wanted to say something, so please say what you wanted to say if you have a retort to that. But let's sort of now get to the next generation, right? So this is Al-Banna and Rashid Rida in Egypt, and who are the counterparts in other countries, and how does the movement develop? And by now, sort of World War I and Sykes-Picot is also kind of taken effect. And how do those political sort of events also impact the thinking of the people who carry those ideas or that torch forward?
I think you put it very well. I think your summary was very good, because your summary bridges, it reflects what I was saying, but you go and bridge it, and therefore in bridging it, you bring it to then this next part, which is basically your sort of 20th century modern reformers, certainly early 20th and mid 20th century reformers. And here, we're talking about people like Hassan al-Banna, Sayyid Qutb, Maududi, and the Jamaat. And it's important at the very beginning to say, as you touched on, that we will see as we talk that the birth of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt then is going to have repercussions where it's going to spread, to the Sudan, to Syria, in many countries. And the same thing it will be true for Maulana Maududi. So I'll give the background comments to that. But in fact, the movements that come from Hassan al-Banna or Sayyid Qutb, and the movements that come from Maududi really impact at the end of the day some 8 or 10 countries in the Muslim world where you have brotherhoods, different Muslim brotherhoods, or you have Jamaat Islami organizations, and of considerable size. I can remember about 10 years ago, I gave I did a talk at a gathering that occurs every 10 years in India, in which there were 200,000 members of the Muslim Brotherhood in India, and that came to this meeting. There were far more members, of the Jamaat, far more actually within the country itself. So what we then see is, we see the Islamic modernists, but now we're transitioning into the activist movements in the early 20th century, and the two top ones are the Brotherhood and the Jamaat. Clearly, one needs to be aware that there were all kinds of other Muslim movements that existed, but these are the big and, if you will, transnational movements that are significant. So the Islamic activist organizations, they frame their struggle in a call for a jihad against British imperialism and corrupt Muslim rulers. That's the phenomenon to realize in that period of time. That in fact you had Western imperialism, which was Britain, which was also France, but primarily Great Britain, and the fact that in most of these countries you had corrupt Muslim rulers. And therefore you had authoritarian governments. Now, when you look at then the top people, when you look at and say why are these people important? Okay, they create a vision of an Islamic revival and reform within then a modernizing area. Okay, their writings were published and distributed throughout the Muslim world, and again, it's important. If you're a person today looking at this program, etc., you've gotten used to the fact that we have these vast publications. We have you can get these publications, and they spread all over the world, etc. You go back to that period of time, and that wasn't the case. The phenomenon was that these people were people who could be activists. They could develop their writings, and even within that context in the past, wind up, for a variety of reasons, having their materials actually be spread to other Muslim countries. At a time when you didn't have TV, you didn't have the internet, etc. So that's why the phenomenon is so important. Their writings were published and distributed throughout the Muslim world, and very often they were also done in terms of small pamphlets that were very accessible to people. So not just books, but the writings were in terms of pamphlets, and then eventually when you get the development of audio cassettes. Now, the leadership of most major Islamic movements, mainstream and extremist, nonviolent and violent, was influenced by their ideas about Islam, Islamic revolution, jihad, and the response to the West in a very singular way. Just as, in some ways, as we talked just previously about the late 19th century, bleeding over a little into the 20th century, what we're talking about now are people who were squarely in the first part of the 20th century, and whose impact was such that it spread over into the mid and later period of the 20th century. Here, Islam was recast as a comprehensive ideology to address the conditions of modern Muslims. It produced a reinterpretation of Islamic belief that became integrated unconsciously almost into Muslim religious discourse of Muslims throughout the world, among even those who would have dissociated themselves from Islamic movements. One of the phenomenon that I often saw in the Middle East, but also in, let's say, Pakistan and South Asia, etc., would be that you would have people who did not, and self-consciously did not want to belong to an Islamic movement, but understanding and interpretation of their faith came from the writings of these people. So, for example, in Pakistan, Maududi was prolific, as were a number of his followers, Khurshid Ahmad and others. But you had people who would see themselves as not wanting to have anything to do with Islamic movements, but their interpretation of their faith, of the faith, that is, was out there and available, and so people would have an understanding of their faith and how it interacted or should interact in terms of reinterpretation and reform, but not necessarily see themselves as specifically followers of the very people who set that in motion. Okay, so now when we look at Hassan al-Banna and Maududi, Hassan al-Banna established the Brotherhood. Maududi created the Jamaat. Few in the West or in their own Muslim societies took serious notice at the time. Okay, these were early movements, and no one expected them to really have the impact that they then would have. The Brotherhood and the Jamaat were established in 1928 and 1941, respectively, both within Muslim societies in crises. This was what was shared in common. Hassan al-Banna was a teacher. Maududi was a journalist, pious, educated man who ultimately was taught through his writings and his talks and speeches. And they both, though, had backgrounds and a knowledge of Western thought. Okay, so that was the thing. They had backgrounds and a knowledge of Western thought. Now, you could say that's part of what came in the late 19th century also, but these were people who were influenced by this, but now were dealing with the situations on the ground that were occurring 40 and 50 years after the times of, excuse me, of the early people like Afghani, etc. Both placed the primary blame for the ills of their society and the decline of the Muslim world on European imperialism and westernized Muslim elites. Now, I would just point out that some of this critique could still be said in the world in which we're living now. We could be talking about the decline in certain areas, the role of European and American imperialism, and then the question of the westernized elites and their role. Like revivalists of old, they initially called for moral and social reform, but soon also became embroiled in political activism and opposition. It was inevitable. The kind of message that they had about faith and renewal had to have a critique, both with regard to the, if you will, the colonial powers, but also, given the kinds of governments they were living under, to their governments, which were authoritarian, and many of their rulers would not be seen as particularly religious. Maybe outwardly they played with religion, as it were, etc. So for Hassan al-Banna, the failure of liberal nationalism in Egypt was reflected also in the creation of Israel. And Maududi picked up on that as well. And on the consequent displacement of millions of Palestinians, as was continued, though, under British occupation. Plus, you had massive unemployment, poverty, and corruption. And anyone who traveled in a number of those countries, if you travel in Pakistan, then, but even now in many ways, when you get out into villages, you really see, the difference between urban areas and the life and lifestyle, the poverty, etc. Let alone if you look at the politics in terms of rulers and governments. For Maududi, the decline of Muslim rule in South Asia and the dismemberment of the Ottoman Empire, for him, who were the bad guys in this situation, they were products of British and French colonialism. Though inspired by the past, in particular, earlier revivalist movements they did not retreat, but responded to modern society in their time, okay? So they were just as critical of the failure of Muslim religious establishment conservatism, because much of that conservatism was not only a failure in terms of, from their point of view, the extent to which Islam was responding, and many religious leaders were responding to the religious and political realities of the day, but a sense that the conservatism also could very often be co-opted by governments, okay? And they were critical very much of secular Muslim elites, who they saw as excessively Western-oriented. You see, excessively were, and who therefore they saw, when the excessive Muslim elites who were Western-oriented, they saw their reformist visions as a problem. Okay, although they were influenced by prior modernists like Afghani and Abdu, who'd attempted to bridge a gap between tradition and modernity, these people nevertheless believed that their Islamic modernism tended to westernize Islam. So they wanted to be more critical in their approach to westernization, so that it would not be westernization. In other words, take the best of Western ideas, Western science, but be careful about becoming excessively westernized. And then to recast their Islam in light of Western standards and solutions to the challenges of modernity. So, though they were anti-Westernization, they were not against scientific and technological modernization. And indeed, they use technology. Certainly, the Jamaat is a major example of the use of modern technology of its time, and printing and publishing, etc. So that Maududi's writings and those of some of his followers spread not only within one country, but across much of the Muslim world. And people forget that even in a country like Iran, you had the influence of somebody like a Maududi, but also the example of a Hassan al-Banna. Both of them stressed the idea of the self-sufficiency of Islam, but for them, it was not the ulama's irrelevant medieval Islamic vision. And so you had a critique, therefore, of, if you will, the religious establishment. But rather, what they claimed and sought was a new interpretation and application of Islam's revealed sources that addressed, and this again becomes important, not just, if you will, the elements of faith, of religious belief, but also political, economic, and cultural challenges of modernization or of modernity. Now, they operated, relatively speaking, within the system. There were clashes between the Brotherhood and the Egyptian government, but very much it was a clash that occurs when you're going up against an authoritarian government. And the same thing at times could happen with a Maududi. But where you see a significant development taking place is when you then have Sayyid Qutb, who was not a Muslim brother in much of his early life. Sayyid Qutb built upon eventually and then radicalized the ideas of Al-Banna and Maududi. But Qutb himself initially was educated basically in modern education with a Western orientation. He was an admirer of the West, certainly of Western literature. He himself came to America, and came here with a very positive approach to coming to America to learn more. He was somebody who was, relatively speaking, literate in terms of Western writings, Western literature, Western publications, but given the realities that Qutb saw in America, and then when he went back to Egypt, the realities that he saw in Egypt, he became radicalized.
Or before we, Professor John, before we actually go into Qutb's writings and how he kind of steers the Brotherhood and that kind of thinking into a different direction, I just want to kind of again draw like sort of the broader political geopolitical sort of landscape. So bear in mind, you mentioned Hassan al-Banna starts the Muslim Brotherhood in 1928. That's very much when Britain still occupies Egypt, and there's a sort of anti-colonial movement that's rising, and it's sectarian. I mean, it's secular and it's nationalist and it's Islamist. And Maududi in 1941, Pakistan isn't even created yet, right? And then when Qutb comes by in the 60s, it's a different terrain. There's no longer covert colonialism. Now, what you have and not so much in Pakistan, but what you have throughout the Arab world, dictatorships in varying degrees. I mean, in Algeria, you still have the colonial fight occurring, but you have dictatorships in varying degrees, and now the enemy is the puppet leader or the puppet regime. And I think that's a key point just to kind of point out. And I mean, just to again go back, because I mean, I'm trying to make it sure that we do project forward and see how things different, because once you're done with this, we are going to get into the Iranian Revolution, and we're also going to speak about at some point Sudan and Turkey and Malaysia, and not Sudan because that's a bit of a different case, but in both Turkey and Malaysia, where I mean, in Turkey there is a repression. There's a massive repression by Ataturk on Islam and sort of when it's very much a big political reform project. But generally speaking, post 1950s, 60s, there isn't this massive suppression on political Islam itself. There's democracy in a way is allowed to flourish. And it's interesting that in those two countries, Malaysia and in Turkey, eventually you do have Islamist democratic governments arising. But in the other countries where you have this massive suppression, you end up with Islamic movements that become very radicalized. So let's go now back to Qutb, and just within that context, give us a sense. So firstly, critique me if whatever I said is maybe I've spoken a lot of rubbish. So please tell me I have if I have. Then secondly, just sort of how does Qutb kind of take brotherhood thinking, pan brotherhood thinking in a new direction?
Yeah, I mean, and what you said was very good. It was B plus, moving towards an A minus. It was very good. No, it was really good. No, so, I think the thing that's for me was the thing that was fascinating. The thing that's fascinating about Qutb is the extent to which he did not have anything to do with the Brotherhood until after his American experience. Number one, and number two, that he went to America because he so admired, if you will, Western literature. He was very much somebody who was, steeped himself in Western literature, and the expectations that he had of America, actually, the positive expectations, fell apart. When he actually went there. So if we actually take a look at him, and how that sort of happened, it basically, you had him going to America, and in America he winds up engaging America, as it were, through media, politics, and culture, and he sees an America that, yes, is modern, but he having published a book called Islam and Social Justice, in which he said that Islam possessed its own social teachings, and that a kind of Islamic socialism avoided the pitfalls of Christianity. Yet when he went to America, he didn't get what he expected. It became a turning point in his life. It transformed him from being an admirer to, in fact, not just a critic, but a severe critic. And a lot of it had to do with his experiences in America produced a culture shock that made him more religious and convinced him of the moral decadence existing in the West. What kinds of things? He was appalled by what he saw as its materialism, its sexual permissiveness. There's a story about him going to a dance. I think it might have even been a church dance. I'm trying to remember specifically, but going to a dance and seeing, men and women dancing, seeing the closeness that occurs, when you've got, the dancing, seeing the interaction of even though for many Americans at that time, they would not have any sense that or even the time when I grew up, of a kind of excessive sexual permissiveness from his point of view. It bordered on promiscuity. He saw the free use and abuse of alcohol. Well, that also exists in Muslim countries. I can remember going to Pakistan with somebody who was pious and it would want to take me around to Sufi shrines. But when he had his corporate leaders come at 4:00 in the afternoon, each of them came to have a drink and to deal with things. He saw the racism, what he regarded as racism, in terms of black people and or people of color. He then felt it a bit himself. In other words, he sees the racism with regard to black people, and he realizes that his complexion is dark, and that that he's standing out, as it were. All of that was directly experienced, and also his feeling about or his sense of the presence of and attitudes that existed with regard to U.S. and Israel. So appalled by materialism, permissiveness, abuse of alcohol, what he sees as racism, and in the media, what he sees as a bias against, a bias with regard to Arabs and with regard to, Palestine. He then goes back home, as it were, disillusioned and kind of marginalized, because Qutb's stay in America coincided with the very establishment of Israel as a state guaranteed by the U.S. And it dovetailed with the beginning of the Cold War between the U.S. and the USSR during a time when Egypt under Nasser was aligning itself with Russia and with secular nationalism. So all of these things are hitting him, and this moved him even more towards a concern about Egypt and Islam and an Islamic state. So he goes back home, and that's when he gets involved in the Muslim Brotherhood. Okay, so he felt betrayed in America when he saw this kind of Arab pro-Jewish coverage from his point of view in newspapers and movies, and then goes back and joins the Brotherhood. But he joins the Brotherhood in a situation in which Nasser is absolutely in power, and it's a Nasser that dovetails with the Soviet Union. I can remember when I first went to Egypt, being struck, my wife and I. This would have been in the right around 1970, 71, and being in hotels and suddenly realizing that you had all of these Russian advisors were in the hotels and speaking, and I hadn't made that connection of that influence. It wasn't something that I was studying, and you can imagine how where Qutb would come in terms of his attitude with regard to Russia. And then the final blow, as it were, in terms of his becoming radicalized was Hassan al-Banna's when Hassan al-Banna was assassinated, and then the Brotherhood was very much weakened. That's when he became far more activist. He joined the Brotherhood. He emerged as a major voice rather quickly because he was a gifted person in terms of his writing, if you read some of his writings, but also his ideas were speaking to those who were disillusioned with the kind of government that they had, Egypt, the kind of way the U.S. recognition of Israel and the extent of what they saw as a bias with regard to Israel, and then the sense of of Nasser and the Soviet Union, with the idea of the Soviet Union as basically a communist, godless country. The radicalization gets upped again when he's imprisoned. Karen Armstrong has described his imprisonment, and he was imprisoned for 10 years and tortured. But she describes when she goes to refer to the prison, if I remember correctly, Karen uses the word like a concentration camp, that kind of experience. And he was charged with alleged involvement in a failed attempt to assassinate Nasser. So therefore, one can imagine not only the situation in prison, but also the way he would be treated, if you will, to the nth degree, very poorly. And that really made him more militant and more radicalized. But it's important if you get inside the mind of this person, and this is true for a lot of people when they become radicalized, that for them, they don't see themselves as being radicalized. They see themselves as moving, having a true vision of what's wrong, and moving to knowing that, as it were, radical surgery is necessary. So while in prison, Qutb then witnessed the massacre in which 25 members of the Brotherhood were killed and close to 50 were injured, and he concluded that the government had to be overthrown. So Qutb then took many of the core concepts of Al-Banna and of Maududi, and that's important too. Very often when we studied back when, there would be a separation in seeing Banna and Egypt, and the Arab world, and seeing Maududi in South Asia, and people forget that there was a cross-fertilization. Indeed, also the extent to which one looks at the revolution in Iran, and I was one of the first academics to go into Iran after the revolution, the extent to which, for example, in Iran, Maududi was well known within certain circles, and certainly somebody like Hassan al-Banna, but clearly the writings of Maududi, because one of the geniuses of Maududi and his movement was mass translation of their work and getting funding from even some outside Muslim countries so that Maududi's publications could be readily available and inexpensive, pieces. So his ideas then, at that time, reverberated very loudly in the radical rhetoric of revolutionaries like a Khomeini, and then later on a Bin Laden,
Okay.
in terms of influence.
So you've mentioned Khomeini and Bin Laden, and we've spoken extensively about Qutb. I think let's just join the dots, right? So because the thing is, while Qutb then does gather radical thoughts, and that takes parts of the Muslim Brotherhood, not the whole Muslim Brotherhood, in a certain direction. It also eventually leads to parts of the Brotherhood rejecting some of those ideas, like much later on. And I guess much later on is how it manifested itself, but I guess initially as well. But sort of by the time the Iranian Revolution is done in 1979, what's the landscape in North Africa and Iran now, and even in Turkey, by sort of like the late 70s and 80s? How have those ideas of Qutb and Maududi, and bear in mind, the Islamic Revolution in Iran has its own idea. Yes, there's influence, but Khomeini and Shariati and all of these guys bring their own sort of spin on modern radical liberation Islamic thinking, right? So how do those ideas manifest? And specifically, I want to talk about this because there's this, to a large extent, this leads into Afghanistan and the war against the Russians, which gives us Bin Laden, right? But at the same time, it also gives us in the 90s Erbakan, who is the forerunner to Erdogan, and it gives us sort of much more Islamists who want to embrace democracy, like Ghanouchi. So sort of how does that splinter occur between the 80s and 90s? And just walk us through all of that.
Well, I think that one has to realize that, for example, if you take the Brotherhood as a movement, that by and large, under Hassan al-Banna, the Brotherhood was not created in its ideology, etc., as a unilateral, radical, violent movement. Okay, the Brotherhood existed. It was a strong reformist government, and as happens in a number of Arab countries after, if you're challenging a regime, but not necessarily even using violence, the violence of the regime then winds up legitimating the radicalization that takes place of the person. And Qutb is a perfect example of this, because in a sense, he was basically, his education was basically someone who had a very good education, was aware of Western writing and literature and culture, and before he went to America, admired all of that. And Qutb's if it hadn't been for the um, the nature of the government of Nasser and Nasser's government and how they responded to the Brotherhood, you wouldn't have seen then the radicalization, that occurred. So that, for example, when you're under an authoritarian regime, when a member of Nasser's government gets assassinated, whether it's done by you know a member of a brotherhood, a younger member or whatever, but not necessarily that it's being done by the movement itself, but somebody who's a member. Well, there's no toleration, of anything like that. And then you see the overreaction of that we see, for example, today when we look at authoritarian governments. To the extent that an authoritarian government feels challenged, there's a problem. And if there's any kind of initial violent action that then can legitimate their turning around, and doing what they do, they will suppress at a level of silence and imprisonment that can be astonishing. And not to jump ahead, but just to make one reference, when you've got the overthrowing of the Morsi government, and then there's an opposition to that overthrowing, that then has Sisi basically coming in and crushing and putting, the figures differ here, but 60,000 people eventually in prison, and putting just about any one of the people that he considers leaders, and a number of them have died now in prison. So that overreaction takes place. And therefore, when Qutb, when the violence took place during Qutb's period, that enabled the government to kind of brushstroke the entire and attempt to, crush the Brotherhood, even though the Brotherhood was basically, and Hassan al-Banna's, approach was basically that this should be a reform movement. So I think that's what one has to, keep in mind as we then, go down the road, with these movements.
Okay, so I mean, so tell us about sort of the splintering then between those who are more radical and manifest themselves eventually in Al-Qaeda, and those that are the gradualists and sort of manifest themselves in people who embrace democracy and want to gain leadership through democracy. What occurs there, and what's the role of how does the Iranian Revolution impact all of that, and also impact how the West or Western governments or Western powers perceive Islamist movements?
Okay, so I'll give you a couple of comments, and then you come back and push me on what you've just said, because what you just said lays out a landscape that I can be reminded of how, where you're going with this. What clearly happens, when I look at Islamic movements, and having looked at them, for decades now, what clearly happens is that for most of these movements, until you get to things like Al-Qaeda, etc., but once you've got an Al-Qaeda, once you've got an ISIS, then we're talking about a movement that is absolutely committed to the use of violence, etc., etc., etc. But usually, when you're just talking about Islamic movements themselves in their origins and how they function, to the extent that they become radicalized, it's often in responding to the government. Okay, this is very important, because not only have Muslim governments from the time of Nasser and the Shah of Iran, the Shah didn't even see himself as leading a Muslim government, but a Muslim country. But you see this generalization in which the movements are just completely brushstroked, and you see it today to the extent that not only do we see judgments being made today, but judgments being made in the last number of decades, which I've written a lot about and been criticized, by some, because what they want to basically say is the line of authoritarian governments, or of, if you will, neo-colonial governments that simply want to be dismissive of what they call Islamist movements and not distinguish between mainstream movements and those movements that spin off and become radicalized, but rather say, no, these movements are all radicalized, okay? So, even if a movement then does well, as occurred at a certain point in the late 70s and certainly in the 80s, in a number of countries, you had Islamists being elected and being in let's say cabinets or senior positions in government, whether you were talking about the Sudan or Jordan or whatever. Yet the government itself would always want to portray them in a different light. To give you a concrete example, but I will not mention the specific country or ruler in this context, but at a certain point, I was at an international meeting in a Muslim country in which members or a number of people who ran major, what were regarded as major centers or international centers that dealt with the Middle East, were invited to hear the head of that country speaking. And that particular Arab country had a ruler who would be seen as his image outside would not be, would be someone who's not outwardly associated with absolute suppression of movements, etc. And yet, in a private meeting, when talking to directors of centers, the head of that country referred to the only kind of opposition that really existed in his country, political opposition, and just referred to that movement and said, well, what would you think about people that really want to, basically come out of the mosque and are ready to commit violent actions? That movement hadn't really done that. That movement had been a political force, winning seats in parliament, and having some senior positions, but that gets lost. So what you wind up then is that when you get somebody like Sayyid Qutb becomes the legitimating factor for the absolute attempt at suppression, not only in Egypt, but in that time and even later on, rulers and some of the elites in these countries, as well as certainly in America and Europe, when you look at the discourse that's existed when you go to talk about, use the phrase Muslim Brotherhood, etc. Even today, use the phrase Muslim Brotherhood or almost any Islamist movement, it's fair game, and actually unfair game for people to simply say that these movements are necessarily radical. And as we see, to the extent that they're not crushed by their government, and to the extent that at times some members of those movements have lived in exile in countries like Turkey or in Qatar, the critics will simply always refer to these movements and just say, well, Muslim Brotherhood, they're all radical. Well, etc. And you could see that, therefore, when the Brotherhood, when Morsi was elected, at the end of the day, what became very clear was that the Obama administration never really accepted it. They felt they had to. And therefore, when Sisi took over, remember the famous phrase, which was very disappointing because I admire Obama on a lot of other things. But basically, when he refused to say that a coup had taken place. All right, so now let's pick up the history. When you're talking about the development as then starts to take place, in countries like Turkey, for example, you want to talk about Turkey now, or do you want to?
We can get to Turkey, but I think we need to speak about, because you made a very important point of how continuous suppression, internal suppression, radicalizes the movements and legitimizes radical thinkers within the movement. And there's this broad sort of painting of a brush, which a lot of it is just anti-democratic, anti-representative suppression on behalf of the Arab regime leader, right? But the thing is that the Iranian Revolution is quite substantial, not only because the Ayatollahs take over a country, but also because it reinforces local Arab regime thinking with Western thinking. because
That's
now
right.
because they don't necessarily distinguish between what the difference is between the Muslim Brotherhood and the Ayatollahs, and they just see all of this as all of these groups as wanting to come and make more theocracies and more radical groups that are going to fight America, which is a bit of wishful thinking. So just sort of how does the Iranian Revolution sort of what's it about, like just very briefly. But I mean the question is more posed because it's trying to understand how that reinforces a Western perception of
That's
what
good.
these movements are.
Yeah, that's excellent. Um, and actually, for me, this is the Iranian Revolution really brings out the nature of uh, the how Arab and Muslim governments respond to movements, but also how Western governments respond. I mean, it really is uh, almost a watershed movement period in really seeing very directly what's going on. Because when you take Iran, you have a country in which you had Iran, the Shah, and the Shah seen as by outside uh, Western rulers. Remember, it's important for people to realize that Iran had been itself had uh, uh, an issue with regard to European intervention, the U.S., the U.K., but not only Europe, also Russia in its history. Now, the Shah, when he came to power, was basically that transition from his father to the son was accepted and facilitated by Western countries like the U.S. And Europe. And for many in the West, the Shah was seen as this modernizing because he had a lot of oil and a lot of modernizing was taking place. And people did not see the nature of, on the one hand, seeing development in Iran, but not looking at to what extent did that development really trickle down to a significant portion of the population with regard to economic development, uh, etc. That in fact he was an authoritarian ruler, and so it was not uncommon for the Shah to be seen. Certainly in America, they would come regularly to the United States and be on our talk shows or our morning shows, etc. And most people were not aware of what was actually going on in Iran. And so the idea that you would have somebody like Khomeini, somebody who was living in exile for more than 20 years from his own country, living in a village in France, and somehow uh, a revolution could be triggered in which this bearded, older personality comes back and you wind up with that transition, then dealing with that, the US and Western governments didn't know how to deal with it. So I'll give you a concrete example of where I came to see that. During the period when you had the Americans held hostage, I and Fazur Rahman and two other um, academics were invited to brief state and national security council folks, the people that were dealing with the revolution at the State Department. And in our conversation, um, it was clear when we were talking about, well, how should the Carter administration deal with this situation? Some people suggested, well, a white paper should be done. That is, you look at what's the policy been of the United States, and somebody who uh, presented himself or described himself, who is a member of the U.S. government, I'm sure a very nice person, etc., commented that he had been dealing with the Middle East, was aware of the Middle East and Iran for many years. He said something like 20 years, and he said, to do a white paper could be a problem. And so, I think I asked, or one of my colleagues said, "Well, why would it be a problem?" He said, "Well, if we did a white paper, we might discover that we never did anything wrong, and it could backfire on us. And it was staggering that kind of statement, would be made. In what emerged in the conversation, and in a lot of my consulting, both before and after, with people at state and other government agencies, was that you had people who could be very sharp, very knowledgeable. A fair number of them would have served in a country. Some of them might have been an ambassador in a country, but very often they had no interaction with, if you will, the religion and or the religious leaders or the religio-politics that actually existed in the country. They because it was not seen as significant. And indeed, there was almost a sense that if somebody in an embassy happened to speak the language, there was a sense that he must be CIA or trained by the CIA. And indeed, that's what happened with regard to the American hostages. According to one of my good friends at the time, James Bill, Jim talked about the fact that he felt almost a little guilty because he had trained this one fellow who really knew Farsi very well, and it said to him, this is before he even knew that he was going to go in government. He said language is important, really emphasized it. And of course, one of the proofs that people felt when the hostages were taken was here you had this person who really spoke the language. On the other hand, from a friend of mine in that embassy, what was said to me was that, and I saw this in other countries that I would visit in the Muslim world, American officials just dealt with the government and maybe with the elites. And so very often they had no contact with religious leaders or knew what was going on, or that religion was, a significant factor that should be, taken into consideration. Taken into consideration, not just because of the religion itself, but even because of the political implications. And to the extent to which there was, an issue here, you had a discussion that dealt with one of the heroes of youth in Iran, whose father had been a religious leader. This fellow had gone to France and studied and gotten a PhD there, but he was greatly admired by the revolutionary youth, many of them, but he had died a number of years before. In the discussions that we had, at a certain point, I was being pressed because one of the people there was saying, on the government side, we need to get in touch with this person. And he was very frustrated. He said, Professor Esposito, I keep asking you, and you don't tell us where he is so we can go and see him. And I had to say, well, he's been in a cemetery for quite a few years.
Who was this person?
It was, what's his name? I have a senior moment on this. I've written on him like mad. That you don't know it is very stunning to me. I'm very upset about this. Gee, Middle East Eye should really be right on top of this name.
Is it Ali Shariati or?
That's right.
Yeah,
exactly. Yeah. See, I always, when I get a senior moment, I'm ready to say Bani Sad, and that's not right. Ali Shariati, and you could hear a pin drop. So Jimmy Carter at the time, and again, what I'm doing now is talking to you, and I expect that some of this stuff you may find interesting or not. Some of you may find interesting, but it doesn't work. It won't work in putting together the segment of the program. But I think it's
of course
for you to hear this. That night, Carter was asked about what the parliament had said, and Carter, being the wonderful person that he was and the devout Christian that he was, said something like, if they think I'm going to go down on my knees, see? And that's not what they were saying. What they were saying is, because he said, we're not going to do that. What they were saying is stop doing what's wrong and get back on, our relationship, get back on. But he misinterpreted it from, as it were, his faith experience and its political implications. Now, the piece de resistance on this is that at the end of the meeting, I made a comment and said, I think it's important for us in the room to realize that Iran is not going to be the only issue that America has to be dealing with here. You know, when it comes to the problems that can occur in the Middle East, that there could be other Irans, as it were. And the guy who was chairing it, who was very stressed out, I got to know him after it. Naturally, he was not just chairing the session, was like a key person dealing with the whole issue of what was going on in terms of the hostages. Literally said in the meeting, "We don't need that ivory tower bullshit." Okay. At which point, my memory is that I started to stand up and my colleagues grabbed my wrist because I was so annoyed. Now, a short while later, I was in Cairo and I was brought by a New York Times reporter to the then number 2 in the American embassy. And I get there and it's that person. And I think, oh my God, what's this going to be like? He didn't invite me to this thing and I'm being brought in. And he welcomed me warmly. And I said, gee, I remember the last time we had our confrontation. And he said, I thought of you when I was on the reviewing stand when Sadat was assassinated. He said, the first thing I thought of was our interaction in DC. So what I'm trying to say is that, it's examples of, the extent to which we just weren't prepared to deal, because it wasn't until 1984 or 86, I think it was 86, that the Foreign Service Institute, which trained diplomats who were going to the Middle East, etc., dealt and included anything on Islam and interaction of religion. I was asked by the guy that ran that program to get involved, and then some of my colleagues also. And so regularly we would then meet with the people who were going to countries in the Middle East, going to countries in Southeast Asia, etc. But there was no sense of needing to deal with that. I had a good friend, somebody who was in the embassy, and she had been visiting universities at times and even some religious leaders. And her colleagues thought it was a total waste of time. And she went to the then ambassador and said, am I like, if this is against the way you want to do things, am I doing something wrong? And he said, no. But that was the case. In other words, we did not look. So here you got Iran, you got a revolution. If you haven't been dealing with and in the training of your people of the role that Islam is taking, among the followers of potentially of a Khomeini, etc. What do you expect then when things go wrong? And this is not just the example there. It was the example in Egypt. It was example in a number of places. In the Egyptian case, a very well-placed person in the embassy said, because when I talked to him, I said, we're not dealing with the issues here of movements and distinguishing between, let's say, the Muslim Brotherhood and then some of the really terrorist, movements. And he said, we don't spend too much time on it. He said, because one of the problems would be, he said, then you have to send a report back to Congress, and that creates all kinds of problems in terms of the way we move forward. So this is the kind of context in which this is occurring.
I think that's a great anecdote, the one you have at the end. Okay, so the thing is, I want to kind of, it's a bit different, and I mean, there's so much we can speak about, but just let's try to speak about sort of the moderate, and when I say successful, I'm going to talk about successful in the sense that they achieved electoral success, right? So sort of the gradualist, moderate Islamist movement that achieve electoral success. So that happens in Turkey, it happens in Malaysia in a few incarnations. Right, with Mahathir Mohamad and then later Anwar Ibrahim, and there's politics there, which is interesting. It occurs in Sudan. That's a complicated case, and it goes south and ends up being quite south. And then eventually it also crystallizes for a short while in Tunisia post Arab Spring. But I mean, so we don't have to talk about all of those four examples, and maybe Sudan is a different case study, so we can talk about it later. But how do those moderate Islamists gain control? And I don't want to go into like the sort of the logistics of it, but what takes roots in those societies and how does that influence the Islamic movement?
Listen, what you're raising is really, really important. And so what we have to talk about is that you have a period of time, and this is often forgotten, when for a decade, depending on the country, a decade or more, you had Islamic movements that were growing, and that in many of the countries wound up competing in elections, which were not completely free and fair, but doing very well. And one of the questions is, well, why and how did this happen? And I think part of it is to realize that even when we were talking about the past, when you had the mainstream movements and the mainstream followers in the movement, and they functioned without significant repression, often these movements grew in terms of attracting younger people, but also at times older people who were religiously motivated, but also saw inequities in their society and wanted to see change. When we see the use of violence, as in the case of how it grows in terms of Qutb and the Qutb period, we see how Qutb became radicalized and how the government's dealing with not just Qutb, but then with brushstroking the entire movement and followers, and then the repression, how that creates the radicalization. So that's the background to then what we're going to be talking about now. When you have a period where, whether you're talking about Jordan, Turkey, the Sudan, you begin to see, Malaysia, Indonesia, certainly, you begin to see that in these societies there were a variety of ways in which, as happens in any society, populations wind up choosing to define themselves as individuals and also as a society. Okay, but one has to start with the fact that in many of these countries, not all, but in most of them, you have authoritarian governments to a greater or lesser degree, but still authoritarian governments. And very often you don't have free and fair elections, but at times elections would be held. And so what we then have is, for a good decade or more in countries, and I left out Kuwait, for example, in a number of these countries, you begin to see that at universities, that in terms of the student union, as it were, in many of the universities, you begin to see that in addition to your normal student groups that you would expect, you now begin to see groups that are Islamically oriented, Muslim student groups, Muslim student associations. And you see that spills over in terms of then a kind of activism both within the university, but also an activism at times when it comes to issues of politics, economic development. And when you have elections in a number of the countries, you see whether, again, Sudan, Jordan, Turkey, Kuwait, quite a few countries, you see Islamists elected to parliament, or you even see Islamists having a portfolio, in the government. So you have that period, and that reflects what, if there's space, the kind of diversity that can exist there, where religion can be and will be a source for political and socioeconomic development, if it's allowed. What one then has to look at is to say that shows you that time in history, we're in a different time now, but at that time in history, how in many of these societies it was the Islamic student groups and other groups that Muslim groups that dealt with educational reform. That is, they developed their schools. Egypt was very much there. They developed their medical dimension, which was a challenge to the government. I can remember being on a trip that I was involved as one of the leaders, and we had a spokesperson pointing out that when it came to hospitals, that in fact, in terms of medical care, that for the vast majority, or for many Egyptians who didn't have the wherewithal, the money, they got their medical or dental, sometimes the educational side, came through institutions that were run by Islamic groups. Okay, and parenthetically, in the Egyptian case, when this was being pointed out, on the other hand, the young man that was there was clearly trained by the government, and so what you also had was a way in which he would say things like, one memorable one was, well, some of the women commented on the number of women who were, wearing the hijab. And he made this insightful and brilliant comment for somebody who graduated from university. He said, "You don't realize that Egyptian women have a real hair problem. And as a result, many of them can't afford to go and have their hair done. And so that's why they cover their head." I mean, he literally said that. So, being trained that way. So what needs to be in this program that you're doing, what needs to be pointed out is that you did have in the movement in the Sudan with Tarabi, you did have with Erbakan in Tunisia, and then later on with, in the early days of Erdogan, you did have in Jordan, in many countries, you did have in Kuwait, etc., where Islamists were elected to parliament, and were able to function. But then what you do see in a number of countries is that some are able to handle it pretty well. For others, as soon as there's any threat, then you begin to see the extent to which, in many of these countries, you do have family-owned countries, or you do have authoritarian governments. And that's where you then can see, at times, the radicalization that occurs, because as soon as it's seen as a threat, then you get the repression.
Okay. We're going to have to fast forward now, just because there's a lot to still speak about. I want to discuss sort of the war on terror and 9/11 and the Iraq War, and to an extent also obviously Palestine, because that impacts a bunch of things. I mean, an example that we didn't use that had electoral success, we haven't yet touched upon, is Hamas. Hamas has electoral success in 2005, and it's interesting because with electoral success, and Morsi also has electoral success, there's sort of a clampdown. And right now, we've spoken earlier on that the Muslim Brotherhood, or branches of the Muslim Brotherhood, were prescribed in varying degrees, or were banned in varying degrees in Arab countries in the 80s and 90s. But now you have a situation in the West where these countries, or these branches of the Muslim Brotherhood, or the Muslim Brotherhood itself, are being prescribed as terrorist entities. But this has only occurred post-Arab Spring. This didn't occur before the Arab Spring.
That's right. Right.
So it's a bit different, because obviously Sudan fails for different reasons I wouldn't call Turkey a failure, but there's definitely questions about Erdogan and his autocratic streak. And in many ways, Erdogan was seen in the early 2000s and even the 2010s as this ideal leader that was very progressive and that had embraced democratic values and was, developing his country economically. And then there's a slide into autocracy. And then it's also about, and we're going to get to the war on terror after this, but I just want your comments on this, on sort of the failures of democracy in terms of when Muslim Brotherhood actually got power. And then there's Morsi. There's the Arab Spring, and Morsi gets power. And of course, the suppression by Sisi on the Muslim Brotherhood and Morsi has been appalling and awful. But to what extent was the Muslim Brotherhood also, at fault in terms of how they dealt with leadership and governance when they actually won and did rule Egypt?
The reality, in Turkey, which was very, very interesting, was that, clearly you had a situation where when one thought of Turkey and when one was studying about Turkey, this is in the past, back in the past, the whole idea was that the Turkey was created in this unique way as basically a secular state, that Ataturk, put it on a kind of Western motivated religion was allowed to exist, but was marginalized. And so if you were talking about education, the military, success or admission or etc., would not go to those who were belonged to any Islamic group, or in the case of women, for example, to a woman who covered her head or etc., would not be allowed to run for parliament, would not be admitted to a lot of the more elite universities, and that could also be true for males. So you had this secular-oriented state. But then you had Erbakan, who's a very interesting person in that he comes along, and yes, he emerges as a major Islamic leader or thinker, but he's somebody who went to Germany and did a PhD in Germany, and I think, if I remember correctly, worked in Germany for a while and then came back. So you had somebody who could bridge the kind of divide between the idea that to be an elite in Turkey in any sense was to be somebody whose profile would be very secular and in a sense not religious, but very secular. So in Erbakan, his attraction and the movement and the followers that he got were, again, this younger generation that now chose to be, they were getting good educations, going to good universities, but also were Islamically oriented and committed, and therefore Islamically oriented institutions, social clubs, etc., developed, and Erbakan managed to stay, within the, as it were, within the system, was able to function. With Erdogan during the Erbakan period, as you know, was elected mayor in Istanbul, and he was very effective, even though many of the not only secular elites but many just very secular Turks had a problem with that kind of profile. And so I can remember having a taxi driver who was had a good education and background and articulate, but who, when Erdogan was mayor, and Erdogan was very successful, I could see he was conflicted by it. We were in a car and we were just talking, and we started talking about newspapers, and he said, well, yeah, but that newspaper, he mentioned the newspaper, is kind of Muslim oriented and it's not that good. And he said, do you know anything about it? I said, well, yes, some of my stuff, I do interviews and I write for them. It was like dead silence. And then I said, well, what do you really think about him as a mayor? And he said, I think he's been very good and very successful, and I can remember being involved in a big packed auditorium and debate in which we were discussing Islam and democracy. And I was presenting a position that was articulating the idea, and I wasn't just speaking directly about Turkey. I was just talking about the fact that in that period of time, one of the options that many had, and of younger generations, but also some in older generations, was the option to be, a modern, well-educated person in society, and also be Islamically oriented and express that in a variety of ways, socially, educationally, etc. And the person who chaired the session, at the end of it, said that he really enjoyed what I said. And then he said to me, he said, but if I had said that, he said, I might be concerned about how that would be taken, how I would then be treated by the government. I mean, so much so that my wife was concerned and sort of said, maybe we should go to the airport and get on a plane and fly back. Because what he was sort of saying is, he said, he was a media person. He said, I could not say what you were saying. And I wasn't specifically talking necessarily about Turkey. I was talking about, if you will, the Islamic revival within Muslim countries, or you know what I mean?
Yep.
So that was the dynamic that took place in Turkey. And when Erdogan came to power, we saw transitions taking place. Many people aren't aware of the fact that when he was elected, the interesting thing was to know that the prime minister, as well as one or two senior ministers that I knew at the time, that their children were all being educated overseas. But among the reasons were, especially the children that were women, that they wanted them to be able to get an education and to have a more open experience. And at that time, even with the election, the fellow who was I think was foreign minister, his wife could not come to certain official events that were in a certain government building because she covered.
Is this Gul or Dawud?
That's right, Gul.
Yeah,
it was Gul. Yeah. And so you had that, and that was very much there. And you had, for example, Gul, but also other senior members who were involved. One of them who went on to be eventually the prime minister when Erdogan became president.
Okay.
That's right. He had founded his own institute and school, which my wife and I visited. We toured, and he and his wife represented this kind of new Islamically elite. His wife was a physician. He had founded this school so that young people could not just go there as their primary place, but also that others could go and could, again, as it were, to see history, as it were, and to see the world in which they were living, but see it within a kind of Islamic, context. So that kind of transition, clearly took place to a remarkable degree. I mean, as you know, at that time, people were stunned that in a country like Turkey, you could have the persistent election and re-election of the party. Now, what's happened in the last a decade or so becomes more complicated.
Let's get to why Erdogan, why do you think that slide to autocracy occurs? And why do we see, it's not similar, but we also see failures in Sudan, and we also see some failure, although it's a very short period, we see failure by Morsi in Egypt in terms of their inability to sort of govern in a more wise way. That doesn't obviously take away from the repression that there was faced, but yeah, let's start with Erdogan. So what goes wrong there?
I think that if one takes a look at, I tend to describe it in terms of human nature when you look at political leaders and governments. The fact is that whether we're talking about countries in the West or countries in the Muslim world, when people who are elected to positions and have a great deal of power, issues can occur in terms of the political situation. You look at the United States today, for example. If we were talking back in the days of Obama, let's say somebody like Obama, it doesn't just have to be Obama, one would say, well, you never expect that in the US you'd wind up where we are politically. You look at Europe today, increasingly, Italy and other places, and the movement of governments. And I think that, I'm not an expert on Turkey, but I think that.
So it's bad governance and human failure, as is in most societies.
Yeah, the example that you're bringing up is particularly difficult for me to deal with for issues that have to do with its impact on people.
Okay, and
I don't want impact on me, but it'll be impact on.
Yeah, no, I understand. And so, what can you comment on that with regards to Sudan and Morsi's Egypt?
Yeah, I think that, for example, I knew Hassan Turabi for many, many years, from right after the Iranian Revolution. I held a meeting, a closed meeting that was attended by a small group of academics and other folks, and eventually it led to a book called Voices of Resurgent Islam. And Turabi was one of the people that came there, and then I spent a lot of time going back and forth, and in fact, with Turabi, I couldn't get a chapter from him, and I finally wrote to him and said, you said the only time that you write, and the book that you did on women was really good, etc., was when you were in prison, because then you had time. And I said, if you come to America, I will imprison you at my institution and just free you for lunch, and then you come back for dinner at my house and you stay there. And so we had this long relationship, and I would go to the Sudan. But what I saw in the Sudan was you had different political forces. You had the ultimately, I think that that Turabi had to deal with a Numeri, and then at a certain point, I think he thought it was doing something, cooperating with that government was worthwhile. And I remember bringing that up with him when there were a rumor that he was going to cooperate, the Brotherhood would cooperate, and he seemed to feel that that he would be able to do that without any kind of compromise, etc. Well, the fact is, both with Numeri and then eventually with Bashir, at the end of the day, that certainly that sector of the Brotherhood that Turabi still was holding on to wound up accommodating the government, because that was the judgment was made that they weren't in a position to, I think, to really come to power on their own, and they did what they did. I think Morsi's it's a much more complicated story with Morsi. Sure, mistakes were made by Morsi, but that could be true for almost anybody. But Morsi coming into power when he did, the fact is, he was elected, but he never really had full power and authority. You still had elements in senior positions that were still in the government. Certain military people, the equivalent of an attorney general, that were there. And also, the more that came out after the fact, the support for the U.S. was very mixed. If you actually looked at when the coup took place, when Morsi was elected, that was accepted. Okay, generally speaking, by Western governments, by the U.S. But when you had the coup, the first week or so, you had the Secretary of State saying one thing and the president saying another. So one of them would say, we respect the process, this person was elected. And the other one would say, President Mubarak, has been a longtime ally and respected ally, etc. And after the fact, the more recent the story that seems to have come out was that even at that time, people like Hillary Clinton were saying to Obama, uh, you know, you know, she was not supportive of that change taking place, and that's why you had the astonishing situation of Obama saying that no coup actually took place. Now, on the part of Morsi and the Brotherhood, they didn't have much experience. First of all, Morsi was a very bright and trained person, but he wasn't trained for the politics side of it. A number of people who could have, in the Brotherhood, who could have been in the political situation, were not able to be. In one way or another, they were, because of the Mubarak government itself, they were not able to run, for office. So Morsi was not, his background, and he was trained in the U.S. His background was not as a political leader, and he wasn't given enough time to achieve what he wanted to achieve. He had some talented people at the time. Some of us were involved in meetings and conferences. I chaired a session at the UN, a session that was done where he met with a variety of representatives from the U.S. To talk, and it went very well. But it was clear that it wasn't just the ideas of politics. The idea is, if you really haven't had real political experience dealing with and being able to foresee and having even the ability to have enough of the authority, as it were, it wasn't there. But as far as I was concerned, there can be no justification for the coup. There was no reason. Now, you had an opposition to him. Well, the opposition would have had an opportunity. It wasn't going to be long after that there would have been elections taking place. Yep. And that's the way you replace governments. But the fact is that they were able to be as successful as they were because of the support that came from among other things, from the UAE and Saudi Arabia, which from almost the time of Morsi's election were involved in a plan to change things like that. The man that lost to him, as you probably remember, went to the UAE. And Western governments had to know, the U.S. and others had to know what was going on. But I don't think that they were ready to really provide the support that they did. Now you jump to Tunisia, and you would think that Tunisia would be a better case to make in the sense that, when you see, Ghannouchi, who was in exile for some 20 years, and a number of his main people, when you see a situation in which I can remember times with dealing with, let's say, State Department officials, and they would comment that someone would literally say, based on their going visits back and forth, it was clear that when that Ghannouchi was going to be in exile for ages, that his group had been suppressed, that there wasn't support. And someone even said something like, well, and the reason I know that is I'm not just saying this structurally, but I'm fluent in Arabic, and so when I travel, I talk to taxi drivers and other people. Well, what do you expect you know what I mean? What do you expect they're going to be saying? So when Ghannouchi came in, I think one of the mistakes that Rashid Ghannouchi made, and he's somebody who I have enormous respect for. I've written on him, but as I consider him to be a very close, friend historically, to the extent that can be the case. Ghannouchi, from my point of view, should have gone with that segment of his party that said when the first election came that those who were part of the old side, and would want to bring him down, should not in that election be allowed to vote. That should be allowed to vote in the next election. Okay, I remember going after he was initially came to power. To his position, and being stunned at some of the changes that were made, the kinds of people that that he was bringing in, the role of women, for example, and other things. But I remember meeting with some of the losers. You'll remember that Ghanouchi had said to the other parties that if he were elected, he would reach out to all of them. And you remember that one in particular, maybe even two, but one in particular indicated that it wasn't about to reach out. Well, I happened to interview that person. And when you interviewed him, he exaggerated his position politically and was corrected on it and did not disagree. But then said, yes, I support him. And then, almost the next sentence was, without using the exact words, but in another year, I'll expect that I'll come to power. And it was pointed out to him that he had the lowest amount of votes at that time, but yet he was able to play a role. So with Ghanouchi, I really feel it was a failure of democracy. And a lot of it, some of it I attribute to the U.S. and Britain, which should have been providing significant aid. The U.S. focused on Egypt. It could have also been focusing on Tunisia, because that was a big thing. The feeling that, among other things, that Ghanouchi in power, by some, couldn't deliver on, the situation of the terrible economic, conditions that existed. But also the role that the U.S., the UAE, and Saudi Arabia played in bankrolling that coup, and the fact that in fact the reason why you have the current person leading the country is, and not caring what the West says or anybody says, is that he knows that he can count on, some of those states to be supportive.
Okay, there's three more things I wanna touch on, and then we're done. And you don't have to speak about them all exhaustively, because it's been a long chat, and I appreciate that you wake up very early. So the first thing is just some comments on Malaysia and Anwar Ibrahim, and how you see that going, and potentially he seems to be. And I mean, the falling out between him and Mahathir is quite substantial, and Anwar's been thrown in jail and a bunch of things, these are very substantial things. But Mahathir, in his own right, with the exception of those things, is a great leader for Malaysia. I mean, just what's your comments on that? But then you've mentioned the UAE and Saudi Arabia. So the question is, how is the rising UAE and Saudi Arabia, and even a rising Qatar, even though they're very different, right? How's that impacting the region? And then the final question, and I can go through them all like one and one again.
Such light questions you want me to touch on.
and then
I'll never be able to visit again. Go ahead.
I mean, you can kind of answer as you like. And then the final question, and this one you will be able to answer, I'm sure, is how is the West's insistence on starting to prescribe, or already prescribed, various branches of the Muslim Brotherhood, how is that sort of failing? Why is that a failed policy, and how is it going to prevent sort of the building of a multicultural, understanding, universal world?
Yeah. You should be doing a program yourself. You're really good at this, the way you even see these things. I think that we would probably disagree somewhat with regard to Malaysia. I've been going to Malaysia probably almost more than any other country for many, many years. I think Mahathir was a good leader in his time. I think that, and he was very wise in his ability to bring somebody like Anwar, who had, been one of the founders and had led ABIM, and shocked everybody when he came in, including many members of ABIM, when he joined the government. I saw that play out. I was in Malaysia at different times during the various portfolios that Anwar had, and also, what Mahathir was doing. But, my feeling was that at the end of the day, Mahathir was really good, but in his bones, if you're in long enough and you're really talented, your idea becomes, it's your country. It's not at all the same. You cannot say what I'm going to say now, but it's a little bit like saying, well, yeah, Esposito founded that center, and and brought in a lot of funding, and maybe he had a successful career, and he still has something of a career, but he just couldn't let go. He just never wanted not to be the director of the, well, that's where Mahathir was. I mean, in terms of he just, at the end of the day, I mean, Anwar, all the portfolios that he held, I saw him successful, and nobody denied that. The education, etc. Even dealing with the situation of Malays and Chinese, and I saw that up front. I dealt with some of the Malays and Chinese, and the Chinese in particular, their suspicions, and etc. But I think at the end of the day, what you've seen with it, even when they then joined, and then later on when Mahathir, heading into his 90s, still was ready to walk away from, understand, for Mahathir, this is who he was for all those years. And from his point of view, he couldn't see himself, walking away from it. When it comes to Anwar, I can remember Anwar um, um, being being with Anwar in my office at Georgetown when he'd been in prison and handled terribly, got out, and then there was a question of whether or not he was going to wind up in prison a second time, and there were substantial rumors that there was some, and he was in the U.S. Okay, he and was doing some teaching at Georgetown and available, but a former vice president of the U.S. and others were supportive of the possibility of his becoming the top person at the UN. There were others who were just saying to him, "Don't go back," including people, as soon as you come back, you're going to be tried and sent to prison again. And I remember sitting with him, and then even socially, my wife and I sitting with him, because when my wife raised the same question with him, it was, "You're going to go back into this situation," and he agreed that that's what would happen. I mean, basically that he knew that was going to. And we said, why would you do that? And he said, well, what kind of message would that send to the young people in Malaysia? If I didn't go back, that he was willing to go back and go through what he went through, and then somehow come back. At that point, I never thought that he'd be able to come back and win. And then he managed to wind up with Mahathir supporting him, and there should have been a point at which there was a decent transition, and it didn't occur because it was in Mahathir's situation.
Then it was about the Saudis, the UAE, and Qatar.
Yeah, I think my concern is I always liked going to Saudi Arabia. I always liked going to Qatar. I mean, not Qatar, to the
UAE.
UAE. One of my former students is a member of the royal family in the UAE, and really good connections in Saudi Arabia. I think that their development has been incredible. They're economically, and in terms of infrastructure, etc. But and I certainly uh, would agree that that it's they have a perfect right uh, uh, to want to use the resources that they have, the economic resources, etc., uh, to uh, to develop their countries and to make them major players, and major players that aren't necessarily, that are seen as it were on an equal level of, or somewhat of an equal level when they're dealing with the U.S. or Europe, etc., to be major players internationally. But when I look at the question of still a kind of subtle authoritarianism, when you actually look at, for example, electoral politics there, where is it? When you look at uh, the uh, um, the extent to which um, um, people, the extent to which people who are at all seen as um, not as as uh, um, political freedom doesn't exist there. Real political freedom. That's a bottom line. and the same thing is true for Bahrain. So I think that that's a real issue, and I think that to the extent that they use their financial resources to develop their role uh, 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 and their place in dealing with the international community, all of that's good. But on the other hand, when you start talking about what's their track record been on Palestine historically in the last 10 or 15 years, and even now, you know, uh, uh, that it's the fact is that um, um, it, there were all kinds of signs for that the UAE had very little interest in. It was only a short time ago when you would see stories being written regularly that the UAE just wanted to move on and was basically saying we should just put Palestine behind us. And so some of the political accommodations that it's made with the administration is an issue, and it's fostered when in fact there's a sense that they they can get from some Western countries what they would like, which is whatever we do in our country is our business. I think, you know, economic development, et cetera, is great in a country, et cetera, but the question of political development is an issue.
Okay. How is Qatar different? And then the final question after that is,
Yeah.
what are Western powers losing by painting all of these Islamist movements as a bunch of terrorists?
Great, that's the one I love. Okay, but
Yeah.
let's say how's Qatar different? I mean, Qatar is uh, um, a country that uh, um, has a royal family, etc. Uh, some ways in which it's been different. Um, the role of Qatar, in particular, I was very familiar with the role during the period of the current emir's uh, father and mother, in terms of Sheikh Moza and um, the work that she did within Qatar in terms of education. The notion of education city. Put aside the fact that Georgetown happens to be involved in education city and there's a campus there. Uh, from my point of view, that's nice, but I was never anybody who was, you know, the idea of doing that kind of thing for the country and providing the kind of education at home and not just abroad that Qataris could have and others could have, that and also her involvement. We were both on the high level group with the UN and her involvement in that kind of situation. Um, my dealings or I've been very impressed with um, the the dealing with the question of Islamophobia and taking that on and uh, the meetings and conferences that they've held on that. And even a conference on anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, a major 2 or 3 day conference that took place in Spain. All of that's there. Um, um, are there? I mean, I can talk, and I can say that at conferences that I've been invited to or that I've participated in, I've been impressed with the quality of people that they have from not only inside the region but from outside. You know, very, very professional. In terms of domestic politics in Qatar, I don't know much about that. I mean, I don't deal with it. The idea that Qatar has been a place uh, where I know a number of I know about as well as know some people who have had to go there because of the fallout from the what I consider to be the coup that took place in Egypt, and also with regard to uh, the Muslim Brotherhood and with regard to Hamas. I think that I know it's controversial at times, but I think that what people forget when we start talking about Islamist movements, where are they now, or where are they going, or what's happening. I mean, the fact is that everybody seems to forget that Hamas has has historically been a political movement that also had a militia. We no longer, that's in the discourse of Western countries, much of the media, etc. Hamas is only seen as military, and therefore the idea that Hamas was democratically elected at a time when both George W. Bush and the Israeli Prime Minister, if I remember
Sharon.
correctly, right, had said that they would accept the whatever the results were, that they would accept, and that they didn't. And then you look at the policies that then Israel, used, over the years. Um, that for me is a major issue. The extent to which the West ignored that, and so when you look at what is it, a decade or more, where you had at least 4 times that the Israeli military have gone into Palestinian areas, the extent to which both the U.S., Europe, and Israel have gone along with the idea that in the West Bank you have somebody who was supposed to be there with a limited term, and he's now been in for whatever it is, 20 years or 24 years, and they deal with him, in the way that they deal with him. I think that's really problematic. And so the idea that that at times that some have found um, um, I can't think of the word right now because my brain's tired, shelter or survival by being able to go to a country like Qatar or to another country. If they came to the U.S., some came to the U.S. and other countries. There were reasons why they did. There were good reasons, for doing it. So I think that a lot of that just gets really messed up, um, and I can honestly say that um, um, one of the lessons that one learns, I always said that I knew surely in my lifetime there would be peace in Israel Palestine. There would be a state, and I said I compared uh, this to dealing with uh, uh, medical researchers who work on cures for cancer, etc., and would say, what is it like for a 27-year-old to then spend his or her whole life working on a cure and then having to retire knowing nothing, and then dying and nothing had happened. I knew surely in my lifetime there would be peace. When I created the center in 1993, that was right around the Oslo period. And, I thought, and I spoke to a friend of mine who held a senior position in the American government and is around my age. And he had that same sense. Okay. I recently gave a talk in Texas for a group that I helped launch when they first began, a Muslim group. And at the end of it, they asked me about Palestine. We weren't supposed to be talking about that. And my comment to them was exactly what I told you. And I said that I intended that would still be the case. And so if they would invite me back in 20 years, sure, I'd be 105, but I was going to hang in there. What I'm trying to say is this is the amazing and depressing thing that one, as an American academic, one learns. Because really what I'm saying here is that given the way and when I grew up, we didn't get into this as background, but you should be aware of this in terms of understanding the situation with regard to the U.S. and the Middle East. Not only did the American government not until the mid-1980s train any of their people going out with regard to religion, the American Academy of Religion, which sees itself as the American Academy of Religion, okay, did not have Islam officially have a permanent place there as Christianity in various forms did, etc., until the mid-1980s. Okay, and I was involved with that with Faruqi in doing the initial launch. Okay, the Middle East Studies Association, the stars in the Middle East, didn't get it. You know, you've got to remember that the famous attitude back in the day was that modernization and development meant, as one prominent scholar said in his book, and it was a phrase that was used, the choice in the Middle East was Mecca or mechanization. Okay, and so therefore there was no sense. And so if you were in Mesa in the Middle East Studies Association, religion might be dealt with as a historic phenomenon, you know, way back when, but not contemporary. I'm the only person who's been elected president of both. And I was a nobody. I had a degree from Temple, which was a new university. You know, when I told you about that meeting with the State Department, there I was with University of Chicago, Harvard, and Brown or Yale, and we're on a plane, and they're talking about grad school, and they all said, "And where did you go, John?" I said, "I'll give you 15 guesses." And it got embarrassing for them and me because I went to a relatively new university. So what I'm really saying here is that now we find ourselves at a point where when we look at what happened when some 1,250 Israelis, you know, were killed, slaughtered, etc., and how, in light of past history and even history today, there's no sense that 60,000 people and counting and having so many of the Western countries still support this completely one-sided approach is almost unfathomable. It would have been to me as a young graduate student, or probably a young Western student would have sort of never imagined, you know, the rollover that's taken place, and the fact that it's never even brought up in even major media. You know, even when they say, you know, oh, Hamas did X, you know, why did that happen? Nobody says the number of times that Israel has felt free to go in and, you know, bomb like hell and etc. And people have to worry about that.
Final question, John, the one you like. By the West's insistence on sort of trying to prescribe almost all Islamist movements, what are they losing out in terms of building a harmonious future for the world?
I think that, well, number one, what it's underscoring is the fact that key Western countries that ought to know better, you know, as my father would say to his sons, who all had very good educations, and particularly the economist's son, who's my middle brother. When we disagreed, he'd smile at times with him. He'd say, "You're too bright to be that stupid." Okay. When you look at Western foreign policy and Western governments that still tout that they are many democracies, etc., the idea that that we've gotten to a point where when things really, really get bad, a number of European countries have tried to say something about the disparity with regard to what's happening to the Palestinians. But we have to face the fact that if we look at American presidents, you know, Joe Biden was a good man and true, but never really understood the Middle East. And there were a lot of reasons, you know, personal and also interest, etc. The foreign policy that we've taken has enormous repercussions. And what's the repercussion? The repercussion is internationally, we look, and it's one thing to say, we look and say that October 7th was a terrorist action, okay? But then when we see the enormous movement to what international bodies are getting to a point in a number of countries to call genocide. You can't use that word, and you don't say it. When we get to that point, that we then go along with the idea, in effect, that any group that's Islamist, when somehow neither the major media in general nor governments make a distinction between, or talk about the distinction between Hamas as a political movement and what its militia did, and nor do they write about the Palestinians who've objected to what was done. There's somebody who was well placed in Hamas, whom I know quite well, who had been in government when it was democratically elected, but then has been out of government for quite a few years, and who's talked about the fact in recent years that the military wing had to be very careful about when it used violence. In other words, if you're going to use violence, directly responding in a context in which violence is being used against you, but making the kind of move that, for example, was made on October 7th, and the kind of target that was selected, etc., shouldn't have been done. But instead of seeing any of that, what do you see? You see, not only in the United States, but in other places, but certainly in the United States, you see a genuine concern about anti-Semitism and the growth of anti-Semitism, and that should be there. You don't see as if there's no awareness that we have anti-Muslim racism and that it's existed significantly in the West, in America and in Europe. There's no discussion. The words aren't used. So Congress has its meetings all the time, and I think that they should, on anti-Semitism. But in that same meeting, talking about what's the American situation, they should be also addressing this other issue that's not even addressed. The words aren't even used. And you look at Europe, you've got, similar situation.
Okay.
Hope you edit this really well.
No,
because
we will. We will.
How do you have a big house that I'm going to come and live with you when I have to leave?
Professor John, thank you so much for your time. It's been a real pleasure.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Okay. Take care.
Okay.
Bye.